So, good afternoon, everyone. Now, yesterday we talked till 1911. Today, we'll not be able to complete till 1921, but we'll try to see till where we can go. Now, this is the period by 1921. Actually, when we talk about the Indian freedom struggle, that in terms of the Indian freedom struggle, there's something that you should firstly know in general, that a lot of action, a lot of activity is actually witnessed during the period after World War I. Okay, after 1919, to be more precise, there's a lot of activity that begins. And 1920s, 30s and 40s, 20s, 30s and 40s, these 3 decades were actually the ones where there was a lot of prominent nationalist activity. Before that we have discussed, from 1880s to 1920s, it was very less. But it is majorly picking up after 1920s, okay, or 1920s onwards. And that is also not coincidentally, but also associated with the rise of leaders like Gandhi, okay, and the arrival of Gandhi on the front of Indian freedom struggle. So this is one area, especially after 1940s, that you see a lot of activity, which is pretty important from your examination point of view. But here also, in this, there are 2-3 areas that can be important from your examination point of view. One is the role of, or one could say the impact of World War I. One is the impact of World War I on the Indian freedom struggle, and this is something which is important, because often when we study Indian history, we often study it in isolation. Ki Indian freedom was achieved like this. But just like you see today that international events have an impact on domestic politics and vice versa, that is also the case then. That World War I, World War II and events between them also had an impact on the Indian freedom struggle. So in the mains examination, they can ask you a question straightforward. Discuss the influence of key international events on the Indian freedom struggle, or discuss the influence of World War I on the Indian freedom struggle. So that is one kind of interface that you should know about. The other thing is the arrival of Gandhi. And as I've been saying, now we will be talking in every class about Gandhi. Okay? And each and everything about Gandhi is pretty important. Arrival of Gandhi in India, 1916 onwards, and even the period of Gandhian experiences in South Africa. This can also give you questions. They can give you a question in your mains examination. We keep studying about Gandhi, non-cooperation, civil disobedience, quit India. But they can give you a question also, discuss the influence of Gandhian experiences in South Africa on Gandhian political thought or on the Indian freedom struggle. So that is also something that we must know. Then what you also see here is that everything, as I've said before, everything associated with Gandhi is pretty important, your prelims as well as mains point of view. And where within India you see things like Kheda, Champaran, Kheda, Ahmedabad, and views of Gandhi also on all these issues. Okay. And also what you see is the revival of what? Congress after 1916. So these are some broad areas, okay? And there are a lot of specific things from prelims point of view that we'll discuss over a period of time. So let's start with the events from 1911 to. So when I'm saying, then we'll see World War I. World War I was related to the event of Russian Revolution also. वो भी आ जाएगा. Okay, that is there. So let's first start with, we'll write in a timeline based format and start from 1911 onwards. 1911, we've already talked about that the partition of Bengal was called off, right? Then in 1913, okay, in 1913, now we'll basically go on sequentially from 1911 till 1921 in the chronological order. We'll go on discussing events and their significance from time to time. So 1911, the partition of Bengal was called off. In 1913, basically there is the formation of the Gadar party. Okay. Now, what did the Gadar party do, etc.? You just for now write down in 1913 there is a formation of the Gadar party. Now we'll talk about Gadar party in a while. I'll explain the details about Gadar party in a while. But before that, we want to talk primarily from 1914 onwards. Now 1914 is an important year. Why? Two major events happened. One is the beginning of World War I. The other is the release of Tilak from jail. So two major events happened in World War happened in 1914. You can write down with me. So two major events were witnessed. One is the release of Tilak from jail, and after being released from jail, the first idea, okay, let's just briefly talk about this first. The release of Tilak from jail was supposed to make ground for reviving the nationalist activity, because Tilak was of the opinion, and 1908 to 14, Congress had been more or less a defunct institution. The moderates had been unable to take the nationalist movement in any direction, meaningful direction forward. Okay, they had been unable to take the freedom struggle in any meaningful direction forward, and the extremists were, leadership was not available. Now released from jail after 1914, Tilak primarily wanted to build bridges with the moderates. At the same point of time, the moderates also sought to build bridges with the extremists, because they were unable to carry on the movement without extremist support. So there was a certain amount of realization there. And also Tilak realized the need to not directly confront the British head on, because that would again could result in an imprisonment or something that could weaken the freedom struggle. So what is being decided? Tilak basically gives an informal assurance to the British that he would not argue for any direct overthrow of the British rule. Okay. And by saying that he would not argue for any direct overthrow of the British rule, it is not that Tilak is turning a loyalist to the British or anything, but Tilak is trying to placate whom? The moderates, that we can have a common meeting ground. So Tilak basically made attempts after release from jail to build peace with the moderates or who were dominating the Congress. And at the same point of time, supporting Tilak in this effort was Annie Besant. Annie Besant was supportive of Tilak in these efforts. Okay, so that is something which is to be understood here. That release of Tilak from jail, basically, as Tilak was released from jail, he sought to build bridges with the Congress, then under moderate leadership. Moreover, Annie Besant was Tilak's associate in achieving this. Was Tilak's associate in achieving this objective. was Tilak's associate in achieving this objective. Okay. Now, if this much was true, what is to be understood after this is that 1914 was also the time when World War I outbreak. The first thing is release of Tilak from jail, and the second thing was the outbreak of what? World War I. Now let me just firstly briefly explain about World War I. Yes. आया नहीं? आया वॉल्यूम बढ़ा दो उसको. So, in 1914, there is the outbreak of World War I. Now, broadly, we can talk first about World War I as to what is happening there. A general idea is very useful because not everybody studied world history to begin with. So, in that context, what you see is that World War I saw Britain, France. World War I happened from 1914 till 1918. It ended in 1918 and the peace conference was called in 1919. Britain, France, USA, Britain, France, USA, and Russia were on one side, and Germany, Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire was on the other side. Now, basically, USA joined after 1917 in terms of troops in the war. But what is this Ottoman Empire? Ottoman Empire is what you see as the modern day Turkey. Okay, Turkey was the center of the Ottoman Empire. On the Ottoman Empire was something which was a vast empire which extended from Eastern Europe till Iran. Iran was not a part of Ottoman Empire, but what you see is modern day Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Jordan, all of these, Palestine region, Israel region, all of this was a part of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire basically ruled the Arabian Peninsula, okay, including modern day Turkey. So it was a vast empire, and they were on the opposite side of them. Now, it is these players who lost during World War I. That is what you firstly should know. Okay. Now, there is the outbreak of World War I. And why is World War I important from Indian freedom struggle point of view? Because the World War I saw an involvement of more than 1 million Indian troops. It saw the involvement of more than 1 million Indian troops on behalf of British in World War I. And the contribution of Indian soldiers was significant to the extent that the British built what? Yes? Yes. The British built the India Gate, right? Primarily to honor the contribution of Indian soldier in service of the British during World War I. It was raised as a war memorial. And that is why the government is constructing a war memorial right now, because we don't have any war memorial for the so many wars that we have fought. Wo bas, that's the Amar Jawan Jyoti. So that is there. So that is why the government is building another war memorial right now at the same venue adjacent to India Gate. So that is there. So given this, basically more than 10 lakh Indian troops were involved in World War I. The troop involvement of Indian troops, or the troop involvement of India, was significant. And India provided one of the biggest sources of troops for Britain during World War I. And we will see that the troop involvement of India was even much bigger during World War II. Okay. Now what is to be understood? That this is a war primarily fought for whose interest? Or it was a issue between Europeans. क्या issue था वो छोड़िए अभी, हमें कोई ज़रूरत नहीं है उसकी अभी. But it was a conflict largely between European powers and aimed at securing British interests, and it involved a large number of Indian troops being deployed in Europe, West Asia as well as in other places. So the argument, the question was that a large number of Indian troops are being involved without having to do anything with India. So in that context, the question was that whether it was justified or for the British to involve Indian troops in a war with which India had nothing to do with, or more importantly also, another question here was that given that the British were going to employ Indian troops, what must be the response of Indian nationalists, including the Congress? How must they respond to the involvement of Indian troops? Here, there were two viewpoints. The moderates who were dominating the Congress, their viewpoint was that we must support the involvement of Indian troops. We must support the involvement of Indian troops, and we should expect, and we must support the involvement of Indian troops. Why? Because as Indians offer loyalty to the British Crown, the British Crown will also offer something in return. But what exactly will it offer in return? The moderates had always been talking about what? Constitutional devolution of power. So what the moderates could hope for in return for Indian support during World War I is what? More devolution of power, right? That is what they could hope for, more devolution of power, right? So that is one thing. The other thing is that suppose that one thing was that either there could be what? Involvement of Indian troops is going to happen, and moderates can say that we support the involvement of Indian troops, and then in return for this loyalty they would hope for what? Further devolution of power. Now the other possibility was what? Oppose the involvement of Indian troops, saying that this is not a war of any interest to us. Why should Indian troops die for British imperialist cause in Europe, etc.? So oppose the involvement of Indian troops, but opposing involvement of Indian troops was a risky affair. What would the British do? At a time when they need Indian troops in large numbers, if Indians were to oppose the involvement of troops, how would the British respond? The British would respond with a crackdown. So there was the other possibility of openly opposing the involvement of Indian troops could lead to an intense crackdown. And that is why British had introduced also a law in 1915, the Defence of India Act 1915, under which they said anybody who opposes involvement of Indian troops or does anything to interfere with the deployment of Indian troops will be put behind bars or would be hanged also without a trial, without being given even a trial, in the sense that this was an emergency like situation. And that is why the British would tolerate no dissent as long as World War I is going on. So one option was supporting, the other option was opposing. In between this option was something that Tilak argued and others also supported, was that opposing involvement is a very risky affair. But while supporting involvement, Indians must explicitly argue for what? Indians must explicitly argue that after the war, the British must give a commitment that after the war, they will repay Indian loyalty with a devolution of power. And devolution of power for what? For self-government. Because in 1906, what had they demanded? Swaraj. Swaraj on the lines of white British colonies. The Swaraj on the lines of white British colony is what? Self-rule. Self-rule with more and more autonomy. So they are saying, so Tilak comes up with the idea, he's released from jail. So Tilak is saying that, okay, we'll support the involvement of Indian troops, but we will emphasize two things. This war has nothing to do with India. And given that Indian troops are being involved, Indians expect that after the war, the British will repay the loyalty of Indians with a genuine devolution of power. Would repay the loyalty of Indians with a genuine devolution of power. So this is the viewpoint that Tilak says, that we can't oppose, but even while supporting, we should keep the pressure upon the British. Why? So that after the war, what happens is the British do not forget their promises. See, governments have a habit of forgetting their promises. And that is why you need people to remind the government time and again that they must not forget the promise. So that is why Tilak is saying that we should explicitly extract either a promise from the British or keep a pressure upon them without opposing involvement of Indian troops, that they would make a concession to Indians after the war. That is Tilak's idea. And this idea of Tilak it is not just Tilak's idea, it is also the idea of Annie Besant. And Annie Besant and Tilak both were largely supportive of this idea, and this is what led to the starting of the Home Rule League movement. Home rule basically means what? Self-rule. Okay, Home Rule means self-rule, and the Home Rule League movement was led by Annie Besant and supported by Tilak. Annie Besant was the principal leader of the Home Rule League movement, which was started from 1916 onwards, formally, informally from 1915, but formally from 1916. In this movement, firstly, you should remember from a prelims point of view, the Home Rule League movement demanded the overthrow of British rule. True or false? False. The Home Rule League did not demand the overthrow of British rule. The Home Rule League movement opposed the involvement of Indian troops in World War I. It's also a false statement. The Home Rule League is only saying that this is not a war of India's interests, yet Indian troops are being involved. Indians expect that after the war, the British will repay Indian loyalty with a genuine devolution of power, which will establish what? Self-governing institutions in India. That is what they are saying. How was the Home Rule League to function? See, Tilak is an extremist leader. Right? He is the one who believes in talking to the masses directly. And Annie Besant also supports this approach. Basically, Annie Besant and Tilak organized a number of public speeches. They gave public speeches, supported public speeches. They organized plays, public speeches, libraries, where this idea was propagated time and again, that Indian troops are being involved even while the war has no relevance for Indians. And that after the war we expect the British to repay Indian loyalty. Now what was being achieved by this? Practically you could say, sir, nothing is being achieved concretely. But what are they doing? They are keeping the pressure up on the British, ensuring that the British do not forget that the demand of Indians. Even if they have not formally accepted the demand of Indians, if Indians keep on reiterating the demand, then the British will be forced to offer a concession sooner or later. And that is what they are saying in the Home Rule Leagues. See, this is as like this. The Congress today is trying to keep which issue alive? The Rafale. The Congress is trying to keep the Rafale issue alive one way or the other. The Supreme Court, media, koi sun lo. Whichever way. Okay, the French media, whichever way. Okay, it is trying to keep the issue alive. Why? Because it aims to build pressure on the government. Not that the government is formally going to respond to the allegations of the Congress or anything, but it keeps the pressure up on the government to offer an explanation either directly or indirectly, right? And to that extent, this is what is happening at this point of time, that they're building pressure on the British government, expecting that this pressure will yield dividend. Because what is the other option? The other option is to oppose. Oppose will lead to a crackdown. So they're looking at this option of involving the masses, and this was a second mass movement launched by nationalist leaders after the partition of Bengal. They are reaching out to other areas, giving speeches, etc. This is the first time when nationalist activity is resuming in a major way after what? The split of the Congress. After the split of Congress, there is no major nationalist issue which is picked up in any major way, which is now being picked up after Tilak and Annie Besant are joining hands after release of Tilak from jail around the issue of involvement of Indian troops in World War I. This is what is the Home Rule League established by Annie Besant and Tilak. Abhi Annie Besant is giving all these kinds of statements, and in 1917 Annie Besant is imprisoned briefly for a small period, given her role where the British said that this is causing disaffection against the British state. But this was their strategy of starting the Home Rule Leagues. Anything you want to ask on this? Home Rule Leagues in general. क्योंकि आपसे प्रीलिम्स में सीधा सीधा क्वेश्चन पूछेंगे. Who started the Home Rule Leagues? What was the demand of the Home Rule Leagues? So that is something that you must be clear about. And that is a response to what? Involvement of Indian troops in World War I. So the involvement of Indian troops in World War I gave the immediate issue around which the home rule leagues are getting initiated. Is that point clear? Right? So that is there. So the outbreak of World War I saw the involvement of more than 1 million Indian troops. Saw the involvement World War I, the outbreak of World War I saw the involvement of more than 1 million Indian troops to defend British imperial interests in Europe. To defend British imperial interests in Europe. You can write down in the next para, you can write down. The moderates supported offering loyalty to the British. Leaders like Tilak and Annie Besant started the Home Rule League movement in response to involvement of Indian troops in World War I. Next paragraph you write. In response to involvement of Indian troops in World War I. Next paragraph you write. The Home Rule League movement Tilak started it in the province of Bombay, and for the rest of the provinces, primarily beginning from Madras, it was Annie Besant who was responsible. The Home Rule League demanded that Indian troop involvement in World War I was not driven by Indian interests and signified the loyalty of Indians towards a British cause. Point B. Indians expected that the British would repay Indian loyalty, with a genuine devolution of power. The British would repay Indian loyalty with a genuine devolution of power after World War I. The British would repay Indian loyalty with a genuine devolution of power after World War I. Okay. Next paragraph you write. The 1916 onwards, the leagues or the home rule leagues, gave public speeches, organized plays, and libraries. Gave public speeches, organized plays, and libraries. Give public speeches, organized plays, and libraries to build nationalist consciousness and revive political activity, during World War I. Clear? So, told you what is the Home Rule League, what was demand, and what is its significance. Now, if this was about the Home Rule League, this was one response. The other response could have been to oppose the involvement of Indian troops. And this is something that the Congress does not pick up. But even though the Congress does not pick up this approach, it is what? It is the Ghadar party which basically picks up this approach. And 1913 onwards itself, that had started, the idea of the Ghadar party was basically the Ghadar party, you can write down, the Ghadar party was started by Lala Hardayal, Sohan Singh Bakhna, and Barkatullah Khan. Okay. Barkatullah Khan. This was a party primarily with a office based in, this was primarily a militant party with the office based in San Francisco in USA. Okay. Based in San Francisco in USA. And the objective of the Ghadar party was what? The objective of the Ghadar party was that given, basically they want to do something like a mutiny, like a revolt of 1857. Okay. basically they are saying that Indian troop involvement is huge in World War I, right? So the British are already fighting huge wars where? In Europe, and require a deployment of large number of Indian troops, meaning that the number of troops left within India would be very less. So at this time, when the British are already involved in a number of other European wars, and they are basically the number, and which has meant that the troop deployment in India is at its minimum, this is the time when if we can initiate a revolt starting from within the army, which could soon spread other parts of the country also, or which could soon involve other social classes also, then such a militant revolt could do what? Could help in overthrowing the British. So they said that when the British are overstretched, perhaps this is the best time to do so. And we should exploit the opening given by World War I. We should exploit the opening given by World War I. What should we do? We should initiate a mutiny within the Indian troops stationed within India as well as which are being deployed in Europe. Okay, so that is what is the objective, to initiate a mutiny and then basically lead a wider revolt involving other social classes also around it. They are basically planning an armed overthrow of the British. So did the Ghadar party succeed? Obviously it did not, right? So, but then this is what was the idea. Now, a support, and one of the things that they can ask you a question on was that the Ghadar party received a support from whom? The Ghadar party tried to capitalize upon an incident. The Komagata Maru incident. Okay, this incident happened in 1914. Okay, now what is this incident? You should know from your prelims point of view. Okay, and I've given the details of the incident in the PowerPoint presentation. Now, and those presentations will be uploaded today. Okay, now basically what you first need to know is what was the Komagata Maru incident? What triggered this incident? Actually, this was an incident that happened in 1940, and it was primarily related to a number of Indian migrants who were looking to go to Canada. Okay, this incident is primarily because, just understand this, it is primarily the Canadian government 1909 onwards had introduced an act which was the continuous passage. Had introduced an act which was the Continuous Passage Act. What was this Continuous Passage Act? This Continuous Passage Act basically was introduced by the Canadian government in 1909 and implemented after it. And this Continuous Passage Act said that anybody who is looking to basically was looking to settle primarily in Canada and become an economic migrant who is looking to settle down in Canada, they will have to comply with the Continuous Passage Act. The provisions of the Continuous Passage Act were drafted in a manner to restrict the number of non-white migrants to Canada. It was actually a migration policy aimed at keeping the non-whites out of Canada. How? Because they made demands that were very difficult to fulfill for the non-white population. In the sense, and primarily in Canada, a large number of the migrants who were coming were actually coming from Asia, either Indians or the Chinese, etc. So in that context, you see that the provision of the Continuous Passage Act said that any ship which is bringing migrants to Canada must complete its journey from the port of origin to the port of call, from the initial port to the final destination port in one go. Okay, without stopping at any of the intermediate ports. Now this journey would take roughly equivalent to 2 months. Okay. On an average, it would take roughly around 55 to 60 days on a non-stop journey from say any major Indian port all the way up to Canada. And such a journey without any stops was rarely done. Why? Because it was difficult for any ship to carry